Most people assume contradiction is a sign that something is broken. They believe truth should arrive cleanly, align perfectly, and remove internal tension once it is understood correctly. That assumption sounds reasonable while consciousness is still organizing itself around stability, because stability depends on reducing competing interpretations into one dominant orientation. But there are oversouls that do not move toward simplification first. There are oversouls designed to remain conscious inside opposing realities long enough to prevent entire systems from collapsing into ideological extremity. Their function is not comfort. Their function is structural endurance under conditions that would split most identities apart. You can usually recognize the beginning of this pattern very early in life because these individuals often feel divided long before they become intellectually complex. They notice sincerity inside people they disagree with. They notice corruption inside people they admire. They feel attraction towards two incompatible directions at the same time and cannot fully amputate either side without sensing distortion afterward. What others call indecision is often an attempt to preserve multiple valid signals simultaneously. The internal pressure becomes severe because modern identity systems reward certainty far more than perception. Most social structures unconsciously train consciousness to eliminate contradiction as quickly as possible. Educational systems reward conclusion. Political systems reward loyalty. Religious systems reward alignment. Even self-improvement systems often reward simplification disguised as clarity. But paradox origin oversouls experience reduction as suffocation because their cognition was not built to terminate tension immediately. Their nervous system keeps detecting information after consensus has already emotionally finalized the answer. This creates a dangerous developmental period where they may begin believing something is psychologically wrong with them. They watch people around them commit fully to one worldview while they continue perceiving fractures inside every conclusion. Eventually, they stop trusting their own perception because the external world treats unresolved awareness as weakness. Yet what appears unresolved is often deeper structural visibility. They are seeing the instability hidden underneath prematurely stabilized beliefs. The difficulty becomes more severe when morality enters the equation because moral systems depend heavily on binary positioning. A person must be correct or incorrect, innocent or guilty, light or corrupted, healed or toxic. But paradox origin oversouls continuously detect overlap between categories that other people emotionally require to remain separate. They may see love operating through manipulation. They may see fear hiding inside moral outrage. They may see wisdom inside broken people and destruction emerging from sincere intentions. This creates internal exhaustion because they cannot maintain simplistic emotional narratives for very long. Their perception keeps reintroducing complexity after identity attempts to stabilize around certainty. Eventually, they learn to hide this process because contradiction makes other people uncomfortable. The moment someone introduces nuance into a rigid emotional environment, the environment interprets that nuance as betrayal. So these oversouls often become silent long before they become wise. Silence becomes adaptive because they start understanding that most people do not actually want expanded perception during emotionally charged moments. They want reinforcement for whichever side currently protects identity cohesion. A paradox origin oversoul may enter a conversation intending to widen understanding and quickly realize the group is unconsciously demanding allegiance instead. This creates the sensation of constantly standing between realities without belonging fully to either one. The loneliness becomes structural rather than social. Over time, this produces a very specific psychological consequence. They begin splitting themselves internally in order to survive externally. One side becomes socially functional and capable of simplified participation. The other side continues carrying unresolved perception underneath ordinary interaction. This is why many of these individuals feel strangely fragmented, even when their external life appears coherent. They are continuously managing incompatible awareness layers simultaneously. Fragmentation intensifies because unresolved perception does not disappear simply because expression stops. It continues moving underneath behavior. A person may outwardly agree with an ideological structure while internally sensing dozens of invisible fractures inside it. They may defend a relationship while quietly perceiving truths that cannot yet emotionally integrate. They may reject systems publicly while unconsciously depending on those same systems psychologically. Opposite truths begin coexisting everywhere. At first, this feels unbearable because consciousness interprets contradiction as danger. The nervous system wants orientation. It wants fixed terrain. It wants certainty strong enough to reduce prediction and stability. But paradox origin oversouls slowly discover something unusual through prolonged exposure to unresolved complexity. Reality itself does not appear to organize through permanent absolutes nearly as often as human identity prefers. Most systems remain functional precisely because opposing forces are held in dynamic tension instead of total victory. You can observe this mechanically in nearly every living structure once you stop demanding ideological purity from existence itself. Human relationships survive through tension between autonomy and intimacy. Biological systems survive through tension between stability and mutation. Societies survive through tension between order and disruption. Even consciousness evolves through tension between memory and adaptation. Remove either side completely and the system begins collapsing under its own imbalance. This realization changes how paradox origin oversouls interpret internal conflict. What once felt like personal malfunction starts revealing itself as structural sensitivity. Their awareness was never designed to eliminate polarity immediately. It was designed to remain conscious while polarity interacts. That distinction changes everything because it transforms contradiction from identity failure into perceptual responsibility. Yet this realization creates another problem that most people do not anticipate. Once someone becomes capable of perceiving validity across multiple opposing positions, they can begin losing the ability to act decisively at all. Every direction contains consequence. Every certainty contains blindness. Every system contains both necessity and distortion. Paralysis emerges not from lack of intelligence, but from excessive simultaneous perception. The oversoul begins understanding too many variables at once to maintain emotional simplicity during decision making. This is where many paradox origin oversouls become trapped for years. They confuse expanded perception with the requirement to remain motionless until perfect certainty appears. But reality does not reward permanent observation. Movement remains necessary even while contradiction persists. The deeper lesson is not learning how to remove paradox entirely. The deeper lesson is learning how to move responsibly while knowing no position remains perfectly complete. That realization forces a painful restructuring of identity because it removes the fantasy of pure alignment. There's no perfectly uncontaminated worldview waiting somewhere beyond confusion. There is no final ideological position free from distortion. There is no human perspective capable of total perception while remaining inside localized consciousness. Every orientation sacrifices visibility somewhere. Every certainty protects something while concealing something else. Most people unconsciously avoid this realization because it destabilizes moral comfort. If every position contains partial blindness, then identity can no longer maintain innocence through certainty alone. Accountability deepens. Humility becomes unavoidable. The individual must begin relating to truth as an evolving interaction rather than a permanent possession. This creates enormous psychological pressure because certainty functions emotionally like shelter. Paradox origin oversouls often lose that shelter earlier than others. They encounter complexity before they have developed stable internal frameworks capable of holding it safely. This is why many of them appear emotionally intense during certain developmental periods. Their consciousness is attempting to metabolize contradiction without collapsing into fragmentation. Some become hyper analytical, others become emotionally withdrawn, others swing violently between opposing identities, searching for relief from unresolved tension. But eventually, another pattern starts emerging underneath the instability. They begin noticing that contradiction does not always signal falsehood. Sometimes contradiction signals scale. Reality may appear incompatible at one level of perception while becoming coherent at another. Human beings experience themselves as individuals and collective participants simultaneously. Time feels linear psychologically, while systems evolve cyclically structurally. Freedom and conditioning operate together rather than independently. The Oversoul slowly realizes that many opposites are not enemies but incomplete observations viewed from different positions inside the same living structure. This does not erase conflict. It does not magically harmonize suffering, but it changes how consciousness relates to division itself. Instead of immediately asking which side must die, perception begins asking what larger structure both sides belong to without realizing it yet. That question fundamentally alters relational experience because the individual stops interacting with people only through surface conclusions. They begin listening for the deeper pressure underneath behavior. Aggression may conceal fear of collapse. Control may conceal terror of chaos. Detachment may conceal unresolved grief. Even destructive systems often emerge from distorted attempts to preserve something psychologically necessary. This does not excuse harm, but it complicates simplistic condemnation. Once this depth of perception develops, the role of paradox origin oversoul becomes more visible. They stabilize dual worlds not by forcing agreement, but by preventing premature collapse into total polarity. They can remain conscious inside transitional states longer than most people without requiring immediate ideological closure. This ability becomes critically important during periods where collective systems are reorganizing faster than inherited identities can adapt. Entire cultures enter paradox during these phases. You can already observe this pressure increasing everywhere. People are simultaneously connected and isolated, informed and manipulated, emotionally expressive and psychologically fragmented. Systems are becoming more interdependent while identities become more defensive. Contradictions that remain hidden during slower eras now collide publicly in real time. The collective nervous system struggles to metabolize complexity without collapsing into tribal certainty. This environment naturally activates paradox origin oversouls because their architecture was built for threshold periods exactly like this. But activation is not pleasant initially. It often begins through exhaustion with oversimplification. The individual becomes unable to fully participate in binary emotional structures anymore. Old forms of certainty stop functioning psychologically. Yet deeper coherence has not stabilized fully either. They stand between collapsing frameworks and emerging perceptions simultaneously. That transitional state feels dangerous because identity prefers conclusion over expansion. The mind keeps asking which side is finally correct so tension can end permanently. But the deeper movement does not arrive through eliminating contradiction entirely. It arrives through becoming large enough internally to hold competing truths without immediate fragmentation. Most people underestimate how much consciousness changes once it stops demanding premature resolution from reality. Because eventually the oversoul begins recognizing something even more unsettling beneath the contradictions themselves. Opposing truths do not merely coexist accidentally. In many systems, they generate each other continuously. One polarity creates conditions that strengthen the opposite polarity in return. Attempts to eradicate one side completely often intensify the very force being resisted. And once this becomes visible clearly enough, the question is no longer which side wins. The question becomes what kind of consciousness can remain awake while the entire structure turns. People imagine that contradiction becomes easier once it is understood intellectually, but paradox origin oversouls eventually discover the opposite effect beginning to emerge. The deeper perception becomes, the more difficult ordinary participation starts feeling because simplified systems continue demanding behaviors that consciousness can no longer perform honestly. A person may understand that two opposing political structures both contain legitimate fears while simultaneously recognizing that public discourse rewards exaggerated certainty instead of nuanced perception. The internal split deepens because survival inside collective systems often requires emotional reduction even while awareness keeps expanding toward complexity. This creates the sensation of carrying a wider reality inside environments designed for narrower identity structures. Most people still believe contradiction is temporary. They assume opposing truths exist only because information has not fully arrived yet. Once enough evidence appears, one side will eventually disappear and coherence will finally stabilize around a singular orientation. But paradox origin oversouls slowly begin recognizing that many systems do not evolve through elimination at all. They evolve through sustained pressure between forces that require one another to remain alive. This realization destabilizes inherited assumptions about truth because consciousness starts seeing balance where it previously searched only for victory. You can observe this pressure most clearly in human relationships because intimacy immediately exposes the limits of simplified identity. A person can desire closeness while fearing exposure at the same time. They can genuinely love another person while simultaneously resenting the psychological vulnerability that love creates. They can crave freedom while unconsciously searching for structure strong enough to hold them together emotionally. Most individuals try to resolve these tensions by choosing one side and suppressing the other. But suppression does not eliminate polarity. It only forces contradiction underground where it begins influencing behavior invisibly. This hidden contradiction explains why many relationships collapse under pressures that neither person fully understands. One partner attempts to create safety through control while believing they are expressing care. Another attempts to preserve autonomy while believing they are protecting authenticity. Both individuals may be acting from sincere emotional logic while simultaneously generating the exact instability they fear most. The conflict intensifies because each side experiences only their own emotional necessity while perceiving the other side primarily through consequence. Paradox origin oversouls notice this dynamic earlier than most people because their awareness naturally tracks interacting pressures rather than isolated positions. That perception becomes emotionally exhausting because it prevents simple emotional polarization from stabilizing completely. During arguments, they continue sensing the pain beneath the aggression. During betrayal, they continue perceiving the unresolved fear beneath destructive behavior. During reconciliation, they continue detecting fractures that emotional relief temporarily conceals. This does not make them morally superior. In many cases, it actually makes emotional recovery slower because simplified narratives cannot fully close the internal process. Over time, this creates a dangerous temptation toward emotional detachment. The oversoul begins suspecting that commitment itself may require selective blindness in order to function sustainably. If every system contains contradiction, perhaps intimacy becomes impossible without self-deception somewhere along the way. Many paradox origin oversouls quietly approach this threshold during adulthood. They begin reducing emotional investment not because they lack feeling, but because expanded perception makes total certainty impossible to maintain. Yet this withdrawal creates another fracture that eventually becomes impossible to ignore. Human beings are not built only for observation. They are also built for participation. A consciousness that remains permanently outside emotional investment eventually begins losing access to transformational experiences that only emerge through direct relational exposure. The oversoul starts realizing that contradiction is not merely something to perceive externally. It is something consciousness must survive internally without abandoning movement entirely. This realization changes how paradox is interpreted psychologically. Instead of functioning only as a source of instability, contradiction begins revealing itself as developmental friction. Opposing emotional forces generate pressure capable of exposing hidden structures inside identity itself. A person learns where attachment becomes dependency. They learn where independence becomes avoidance. They learn where honesty becomes cruelty disguised as clarity. Contradiction stops behaving like meaningless suffering and starts behaving like structural revelation. But this movement becomes even more destabilizing once power enters the equation because power intensifies every contradiction already present within consciousness. Most individuals believe power simply reveals who someone truly is. The deeper reality is more dangerous than that. Power amplifies whichever internal tensions remain unresolved while simultaneously reducing external resistance strong enough to expose them clearly. The person may believe themselves compassionate until authority removes accountability from their environment. Another may believe themselves principled until fear of exclusion threatens social survival. Paradox origin oversouls often perceive these shifts long before surrounding systems acknowledge them publicly. They notice subtle distortions entering leadership structures where collective narratives continue idealizing those structures emotionally. They observe institutions defending values externally while violating those same values operationally beneath the surface. This creates severe psychological pressure because the oversoul continues perceiving contradiction while the group still requires symbolic certainty in order to preserve cohesion. Speaking too early threatens exile. Remaining silent threatens internal fragmentation. This is why many of these individuals experience periods where they feel alienated from every available ideological structure simultaneously. One system demands obedience through fear. Another demands conformity through morality. Another demands loyalty through identity attachment. Each structure presents itself as complete while unconsciously depending on blind spots for stability. The oversoul becomes unable to fully surrender to any framework because perception keeps detecting unresolved fractures inside all of them. At first, this can produce cynicism because consciousness mistakes widespread contradiction for proof that sincerity itself is impossible. The individual may begin assuming all morality is performative and all systems are inherently corrupt beyond repair. But cynicism is not expanded perception. Cynicism is exhausted perception collapsing into defensive reduction after prolonged exposure to contradiction without deeper integration. It still simplifies reality, it simply simplifies it in the opposite direction. The deeper movement begins only when the oversoul realizes contradiction does not erase sincerity. Human beings can carry authentic intentions while simultaneously generating destructive consequences they do not fully perceive. Entire systems can begin from legitimate necessity while evolving into structures that perpetuate harm unconsciously over time. A person can speak truth while acting from unresolved fear beneath that truth. These overlapping realities feel unbearable initially because identity prefers cleaner moral architecture than existence consistently provides. This tension becomes especially severe during collective instability because collapsing systems force hidden contradictions into visibility all at once. Societies begin speaking about freedom while increasing surveillance psychologically and technologically. Individuals demand authenticity while curating identity continuously through social performance. Communities preach connection while accelerating isolation structurally through overstimulation and fragmentation. The contradictions intensify because collective development has outpaced emotional integration. Consciousness now encounters more simultaneous realities than inherited psychological frameworks were designed to metabolize safely. Paradox origin oversouls often become internal pressure points during these periods because they naturally register competing truths faster than surrounding systems can stabilize around them. They may feel danger approaching while collective optimism remains high. They may detect evolutionary potential inside chaotic transition that others interpret only as collapse. They may resist emotionally joining collective outrage because perception keeps revealing complexity beneath emotionally satisfying narratives. This frequently causes others to misinterpret them as detached, uncertain, or ideologically unreliable. What surrounding systems rarely understand is that these oversouls are often carrying tensions the collective itself cannot yet consciously process. They absorb contradiction before consensus language exists to explain it coherently. This creates enormous internal pressure because unresolved collective conflict begins expressing itself through individual nervous systems first. The Oversoul starts feeling emotionally divided in ways that appear deeply personal while actually reflecting larger structural tensions moving through civilization itself. The individual experience and the collective experience begin mirroring one another recursively. This recursive pressure eventually exposes something even more destabilizing beneath ordinary identity. Most people unconsciously assume the self is internally singular even when externally conflicted. But paradox origin oversouls slowly begin realizing consciousness itself contains multiple simultaneous orientation systems operating beneath ordinary awareness. One layer seeks stability, another seeks expansion. One layer seeks belonging, another seeks sovereignty. One layer fears dissolution, while another recognizes transformation requires forms of psychological death to occur repeatedly. Once this becomes visible clearly enough, the individual can no longer maintain simplistic narratives about internal coherence. The self stops feeling like a unified structure moving through reality and starts feeling more like an active negotiation between competing survival architectures. This realization terrifies many people because identity has been unconsciously treating internal consistency as proof of psychological health. But deeper consciousness does not always arrive through increased simplicity. Sometimes it arrives through increased capacity to remain conscious during internal multiplicity. That realization changes the meaning of fragmentation entirely. Fragmentation is not always evidence of failure. In certain developmental thresholds, fragmentation occurs because older identity structures can no longer contain expanding perception coherently. The danger is not contradiction itself. The danger is becoming so desperate for relief that consciousness collapses prematurely into rigid certainty merely to escape unresolved pressure. Many ideological extremisms emerge precisely from this psychological exhaustion point. You can observe this mechanism operating everywhere once it becomes visible. A person overwhelmed by uncertainty adopts absolute belief structures to stabilize identity rapidly. A society overwhelmed by complexity begins demanding purified narratives strong enough to restore emotional orientation. Entire groups organize themselves around opposition because conflict creates temporary coherence through shared certainty. But certainty acquired through reduction always generates shadow pressure somewhere else in the system. Whatever complexity gets excluded eventually returns in distorted form later. This is why paradox origin oversouls become critically important during transitional eras, even while often feeling personally unstable inside them. Their architecture allows them to remain conscious longer inside unresolved realities that other systems attempt to close prematurely. They can hold awareness open while collective structures reorganize beneath visible events. Yet this ability carries enormous psychological cost, because prolonged exposure to contradiction without deeper grounding can slowly erode emotional continuity itself. The oversoul begins questioning whether stable truth exists anywhere at all. That question marks the threshold where paradox either destroys orientation completely or transforms consciousness into something wider than ideological identity. Because eventually the oversoul begins recognizing that contradiction is not merely appearing inside human systems. Contradiction appears woven directly into existence itself. Reality expands through differentiation while simultaneously pulling structures toward integration. Consciousness individuates while searching continuously for reunion. Life preserves itself through competition while depending completely on interdependence underneath. And once this becomes impossible to unsee, the fear changes shape entirely, because the mind is no longer asking which side is true. It is beginning to suspect that reality itself may remain alive precisely because no single side is ever allowed to become complete forever.
If this transmission resonated, the spiral continues. You did not arrive here by chance, and you do not leave unchanged. More teachings are unfolding across the Haret library, each one meeting you where you are, not where you think you should be. Follow resonance. The next threshold is already listening.